from desert warriors to empire builders in a single generation. When Muhammad's death in 632 CE left Arabia united under Islam, few expected these desert tribes would topple two ancient superpowers, experience the stunning campaigns that shattered Persian armies at Qadisiyah, captured Ctesiphon's magnificent palace, and pursued the last Sasanian king to his lonely death. Follow Amr ibn al-As as he outmaneuvers Byzantine forces at Babylon Fortress, secures Egypt's legendary grain fields, and transforms Alexandria from Roman jewel to Muslim prize. Witness how brilliant Arab generals, fighting with religious zeal and tactical innovation, permanently redrew the map of the ancient world, replacing empires with a caliphate that would endure for centuries. Here, before empire banners brushed their shadows over desert towns, life worked itself into tight circles, oases, wells, caravan stations, and the long memory of tribes. Camels bawled at dawn while date palms shook in the wind. Women drew water from stone-lined shafts. Men haggled under reed-mat shade about grazing rights and blood prices. Honor, not coin, seemed the visible currency, yet even honor bent to the root, to frankincense from Dhofar, leather from Yathrib's gardens, Meccan trade passing up the Red Sea spine towards Syria. The peninsula's map was not borders, but corridors, paths that fed the hunger of distant empires. In the north, imperial money talked louder than tribal boasts. Ghassanid princes, Arabic in tongue, Christian in faith, drank from Byzantine fountains and kept watch over Syria's marches. Across the Iraqi frontier stood the Lakhmid court at Hira, Arab clients of the Sasanian kings, their palaces fronting canals green as jade after flood. Both houses learned a single lesson. Rome and Persia were patrons until they were not. Subsidies rose and fell with court intrigues in Constantinople or Ctesiphon, and when the gold slowed, horsemen felt it first. Along the western corridor, Mecca's sanctum gathered both pilgrim and prophet. Traders tallied Yemeni aromatics, Ethiopian cloth, and Persian metalwork, then sent caravans north under the truce that sanctuaries demanded. Yet beneath every ledger lay scarcity. The land itself was a hard master. Pasture shrank with a single rainless season, and a summer locust swarm could unmake a year's plans. If wealth lay anywhere in superabundance, it lay outside, in Byzantine storehouses and Sasanian treasuries, in granaries, mint-fresh coin, and the customs posts that taxed other people's surplus. Rivalries turned perpetual because memory did. A feud might begin with a sheep and end, 2 winters later, with a ravaged camp. Poetry kept score. A victorious raid meant reciting lineage to the beat of hooves and the cut of blades. Who struck first, who stood fast, whose spear broke. Still, the tribes were not chaos. They were federations knotted by oath and necessity, dissolving and reforming as conditions shifted. When one confederation weakened, another rose, and always the caravans searched for escorts who would sell safety by the mile. Then the world beyond cracked. The long war between Byzantium and the Sasanians, from 602 to 628 AD, drained 2 giants at once. Cities burned on both sides. Bishops fled with relics. Persian banners passed before the gates of Constantinople, and then ebbed. What remained after the treaties were signed were armies thinned, treasuries light, frontier garrisons behind on pay, and client kingdoms unsettled by years of emergency. The shock reached even the tents pitched far from city walls. A tired empire hires less, punishes slower, and yields ground step by step without noticing. In this age of strain, a voice began to gather people, rather than merely praise ancestors. The messenger preached in Mecca and was answered with mockery, then boycotts, then plots in dark rooms. When he and his followers migrated to Yathrib, the city took a new name from his presence, Medina, and a new alignment from his law. Clans that had balanced grudges like ledgers found dispute replaced by adjudication. The market, once the prize of whoever could browbeat it, became a space governed by fairness. The tribal habit of alliance widened into the Ummah, a fellowship grounded in faith but proven on the ground by order. Medina's pact did not abolish the old world so much as reroute it. Raiding, once an art of prestige, became policy, curbed, timed and aimed. Caravans still moved north, but now scouts rode ahead under a banner with rules attached. Victories were measured not only in captured goods, but in new treaties, secure wells, and villages that shifted allegiance. The old style of boasting persisted in verse, yet behind the verses stood registers of spoils. The distribution recorded so envy could not accuse the center of favoritism. The first collision with imperial power came not at a lonely well, but under the walls of a Roman frontier. In 629 AD, a Muslim force marched to Mu'tah, where the ground breaks toward the Balka and the Arnon. They carried letters of invitation and found instead a storm of spears, Ghassanid levies under Byzantine eyes, heavy cavalry, the discipline of drilled men. Commanders fell one by one. Still, the column did not dissolve. Another hand took the standard each time it dropped. By day's end, the army withdrew intact, bloodied yet unbroken, and returned with the knowledge that imperial war was a weight they could bear. Mu'tah became a hinge, less for what it won than what it proved. News of a disciplined retreat echoed through tents and town squares alike. If the emperor's clients could be met in the field and lived to tell it, then the balance had shifted a finger's breadth. Scouts paid closer attention to Byzantine roads. Envoys measured which Arab princes leaned toward Constantinople out of habit, and which out of renewed conviction. The lesson was not bravado, it was calibration. The northern border was no longer an absolute. Meanwhile, the economic truth sharpened to a point. Arabia could not mint abundance from sand. Prosperity meant access to harvests grown elsewhere, to coins struck elsewhere, to crafts worked in cities with rivers. Faith gave unity, but unity alone did not fill granaries. The draw of imperial wealth was less greed than arithmetic. Integrate the peninsula into flows of surplus, and the new community would thrive. Fail, and even the best law could not feed its people. Campaigns had ethics, yes, but they also had ledgers, the calculus of fodder, pay, shipment, and tax. That logic also explained the attention paid to client kingdoms. The Ghassanids, pious and polished, knew court ritual and frontier skirmish with equal fluency. Their loyalty was a bridge Rome could walk or stumble on. The Lakhmids, once guardians of the road from Ctesiphon to the desert, had learned how to make Persian favor into local power. Between these houses lay towns that bought peace with gifts and bought time with silence. Each envoy sent from Medina tested not only hearts, but budgets. Who could afford to switch patrons? Who would risk arrears with Constantinople or Ctesiphon for the promise of nearer sovereign? Raids that followed were not blind lunges. Columns aimed at caravans tied to specific magnates. Pressure applied where tribute could be leveraged into recognition. A surrender at a market town meant not mere plunder, but a tax roll. A negotiated truce at an oasis meant water rights secured for future marches. Even setbacks taught. When a patrol misjudged a tribal feud and stumbled into a sandstorm of resentments, the council returned to the map and amended the route for next season. Administration grew as quickly as courage. By the time the messenger's final pilgrimage filled the valley with white-clad crowds, Arabia had begun to feel the pull of an outward horizon. Unity had ended the Whit-Monday custom of measuring strength by cousins' blood. Now strength would be measured by how far the banner could travel without breaking supply. How many towns would open their gates at the sound of a call to treaty rather than a clash at dawn? Beyond Tabuk, beyond Dumat al-Jandal, lay roads patrolled by men who owed their wages to emperors exhausted by decades of war. So the stage stood set, a hardened community whose law tamed vendetta, a leadership that thought like administrators as well as captains, a peninsula still poor in rainfall but newly rich in cohesion. Across the borders, two empires panted in armor, dented by years of marching in circles, their client princes unsure whether yesterday's patron was tomorrow's liability. To the north, the Roman eagle looked tired on its standards. To the east, the Persian crown rode with a boy king whose nobles weighed him on scales of convenience. Between those horizons, riders saddled up at dawn, eyes on markets and milestones alike, certain now that the desert's narrow margins could be widened only by stepping beyond them. In the summer of 632 AD, Medina fell into a silence so heavy that even the marketplace seemed hushed. The messenger had died, and with him many feared the fragile unity that bound Arabia together. Men who had walked behind him at battles and treaties now staggered beneath the news, some refusing to believe it at all. Umar ibn al-Khattab, fierce of will, threatened any who dared claim the Prophet was gone. Yet Abu Bakr, calm even in grief, recited the words that steadied hearts. Muhammad was mortal, but the faith he preached was eternal. That moment, spoken on a porch in Medina, preserved the cohesion of a community that teetered on collapse. Still, grief alone did not resolve the storm. Questions of authority pressed in like desert winds. Who would lead the believers now that no prophet remained? In the hall of Saqifa, tempers flared. The Ansar, Medina's native supporters, argued that leadership should pass to them, guardians of the Prophet's new city. The emigrants from Mecca, proud of their sacrifices and ties to Muhammad, countered with their own claim. Swords did not leave their scabbards, but voices rang sharp until Abu Bakr urged them toward unity. He nominated Umar and Abu Ubaidah, men of proven loyalty, but both declined and swore allegiance to him instead. One by one, hands clasped, and the first caliph was chosen. The succession was not without dissent, yet in that fragile consensus lay the survival of the new state. Beyond Medina's walls, however, loyalty thinned. Many tribes had seen Islam less as faith than as treaty, bound to Muhammad's person rather than to the community he built. With his death, they considered the agreement ended. Taxes, once paid into Medina's coffers, were withheld. Other leaders rose, some declaring themselves prophets in their own right. Among them were Musaylima in Yamama, Tulayha among the Banu Asad, and Saja, a woman who gathered tribes with fiery verse. They claimed revelation, promised relief from tribute, and wrapped political ambition in religious garb. What Medina called apostasy, these tribes saw as renegotiation. Abu Bakr, newly installed yet already tested, refused compromise. To him, Islam was not a tribal pact, but a binding order, and breaking from it meant rebellion. His resolve met even Umar's doubts. The stern companion urged leniency, but the caliph replied with unshakable clarity, "By God, if they withhold even a rope they once gave in charity, I will fight them for it." With that declaration, the Ridda Wars began. Arabia itself became the battlefield on which the very survival of the Muslim community would be decided. The The conflicts were not small skirmishes, but wide campaigns. Columns marched from Medina to every quarter of the peninsula, carrying banners against tribes that once had bowed only under Muhammad's shadow. Battles burned across Najd, Yamama, and Oman. Some opponents folded quickly, sensing that resistance meant ruin. Others fought with bitter resolve, convinced that Medina's claim was only another tribe's ambition, dressed in piety. For months, flames of revolt licked at every border of the Caliphate. Among the fiercest challengers stood Musaylima, remembered in later chronicles as the Liar. His base at Yamama swelled with followers, and his forces outnumbered Medina's army several times over. When Khalid ibn al-Walid led the Muslims against him, the struggle became one of the bloodiest encounters Arabia had ever seen. The Battle of Yamama was a grinder, where men pressed so close that swords could hardly swing. Palm groves and walled gardens became killing grounds, and the air filled with cries of faith and defiance. Khalid's command, fierce and unyielding, pushed his fighters forward again and again until Musaylima's men broke. The false prophet fell within the garden walls, struck down by spears, and with his death, the backbone of Yamama's revolt snapped. Yet victory came at terrible cost. Hundreds of those who had memorized the Quran perished in the fighting, their voices silenced forever. It was a loss that shook the community as deeply as the Prophet's passing. From that grief rose a crucial decision. Umar urged Abu Bakr to commission a compilation of the Quran, fearing that the deaths of so many reciters might scatter the revelation to memory alone. At first hesitant, believing it unprecedented, the Caliph agreed. Zayd ibn Thabit, who had served as Muhammad's scribe, undertook the painstaking task. From scraps of parchment, bone, and the memories of surviving reciters, he gathered the verses into a single written collection. The calamity of Yamama, intended by rebels to break Medina's authority, instead pushed the believers toward preserving their scripture in permanence. Meanwhile, other campaigns ground on. Tulayha fled after defeat, his prophecy abandoned. Saja's movement dissolved when her allies wavered. In Oman and Yemen, commanders restored allegiance through force mixed with negotiation. Some tribes resisted until the last well was taken, while others saw in Medina's relentlessness a cause not worth dying for. By 633 AD, the fires of revolt dimmed, and the peninsula once more acknowledged a single authority. The Ridda Wars had ended, but not without reshaping the faith itself. The aftermath left a sobering lesson. Arabia's tribes had tested whether Islam would fracture without Muhammad's presence, and the test had failed. Medina stood firmer than before, its authority no longer that of a charismatic prophet alone, but of an organized state led by a caliph and bound by law. The Muslim community had proven it could enforce unity even against its own kin, and in doing so, it discovered its strength extended far beyond the Prophet's lifetime. For Abu Bakr, the victory was both vindication and preparation. With Arabia pacified, he turned his gaze outward. The rebellion had sharpened swords and hardened resolve, forging commanders who had learned to fight against overwhelming odds. Khalid ibn al-Walid, bloodied but unbroken at Yamama, stood ready for campaigns beyond the desert. The treasury, replenished by renewed tribute, could now supply armies that looked toward the empires looming on the horizon. Thus, the wars of apostasy, though born in mourning and crisis, laid the foundation for expansion. What began as a struggle for survival ended as the proving ground of a new order, an order ready to step across borders into lands whose rulers, weakened by decades of exhaustion, would soon feel the thunder of Arabian cavalry. Arabia had been gathered not only in belief but in obedience, and from that union would spring conquests that reached far beyond the Red Sea and the Euphrates. The Prophet was gone, but his community endured. From Medina's pulse of faith and discipline, a storm gathered, no longer inward-facing, but poised to move outward. The Ridda Wars were the fire that tempered steel, and the blades thus forged would soon strike at empires that had long imagined Arabia a barren frontier rather than a rising heart of power. With Arabia subdued and Medina's authority unchallenged, the desert's riders turned their eyes beyond the peninsula. The empires that had once loomed as distant giants now looked worn and vulnerable. Byzantium and Persia had bled themselves white in decades of war, and though both still carried the trappings of power, their frontier garrisons showed the strain. Soldiers muttered about unpaid wages, nobles schemed in palaces, and client kingdoms wondered whether the great patrons had strength left to spare. Into this uncertainty, the first Muslim raids rode forth. Khalid ibn al-Walid, already celebrated for his victories in the Ridda Wars, became the spearhead. Known for his audacity and speed, he was the kind of commander who turned scant resources into victories through sheer will and maneuver. In 633 AD, Abu Bakr dispatched him eastward into southern Iraq, a land rich with canals, cities, and farms that supplied the Sasanian crown. The task was not yet a full invasion, but a probing strike, meant to test Persia's mettle and secure a foothold beyond the desert. The first clash came at what later chronicles called the Battle of Chains. Persian commanders, confident in their superiority, bound their soldiers together with chains to ensure none would flee. Khalid, seeing this rigidity, unleashed mobile cavalry attacks that darted in and out, sowing chaos. The chained ranks became a trap for themselves. Once the front lines buckled, the whole formation collapsed in panic. Victory came swiftly, and the name Chains became a lesson in how discipline could turn to disaster when misapplied. From there, Khalid pressed further, meeting Persian forces at the Battle of the River. The Tigris and Euphrates valleys had long been arteries of empire, and crossing them tested the daring of the Arab columns. Once again, mobility proved decisive. Muslim horsemen darted across, striking at points where the Persians had not expected attacks, and the defenders, scattered and unsure of command, gave way. Supplies and equipment captured from the rout fueled the momentum of further advances. Perhaps the most brilliant maneuver came at the Battle of Walaja. Here, the Persians, reinforced with allied levies, outnumbered Khalid's forces. Yet numbers alone could not shield them from guile. Khalid prepared a double envelopment, recalling strategies once made famous by Hannibal at Cannae centuries before. He held the center firm while sending hidden cavalry around the flanks. When the trap snapped shut, Persian ranks found themselves hemmed in on all sides. The field became a slaughter ground, and survivors fled in disarray. Walaja cemented Khalid's reputation as a commander of genius, one who could turn inferior numbers into overwhelming victory by design. The capture of Hira soon followed, a city of great symbolic and strategic value. Once the seat of the Lakhmids, Persian clients who had ruled much of the Arab frontier, Hira represented the twilight of an older order. When Khalid's forces entered, it was not with indiscriminate ruin, but with negotiated surrender. The inhabitants agreed to pay tribute, and in return, they kept their homes and lives. For Medina, this was more than loot. It was a model. Conquest would not always mean destruction. Sometimes it meant integration, allowing local elites to maintain status under new masters. These first successes revealed cracks in the Persian edifice. The Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, was still a boy, elevated to the throne amid chaos. His nobles jostled for influence, their rivalries often stronger than their loyalty to the crown. Armies were raised and disbanded with maddening inconsistency, and commanders undercut one another in pursuit of favor. Against such disunity, Khalid's cohesive and disciplined force seemed all the more formidable. Yet victories in Iraq were not the only theater of war. At the same time, Medina launched campaigns into Syria against the Byzantines. The leadership understood that opportunity lay in both directions. Rather than concentrate solely on Persia or Rome, Abu Bakr and later Umar chose a dual strategy. Raids pressed into Iraq while other commanders struck northward, forcing both empires to respond at once. This two-pronged approach stretched enemy resources and magnified the sense of Islamic momentum. For the soldiers themselves, the campaigns carried more than politics. Life in the desert had taught them to endure hunger and thirst, to fight with little more than what their mounts could carry. In Iraq, they discovered canals flowing through fertile fields, date palms rising in thick groves, and towns whose markets overflowed with goods. The contrast was staggering. Here was a land whose abundance mocked Arabia's scarcity, and whose defenders seemed unable to hold it securely. To men hardened by the desert, the prospect of fighting for such wealth seemed almost providential. Still, not every encounter ended in effortless triumph. Resistance persisted in fortresses and marshlands, where Persian commanders leveraged terrain against the newcomers. Some Muslim detachments found themselves stalled or forced into cautious retreats. Yet the overall pattern remained one of advance, with each victory opening more doors. Prisoners and defectors provided intelligence, revealing the fragility of Persian morale and the divisions among their nobles. The conquest of Iraq did not yet seem inevitable, but it no longer seemed impossible. Medina's leaders watched closely. Abu Bakr, though old and weary, grasped the significance of these early forays. The Ridda Wars had secured Arabia, but only expansion could provide the resources to sustain unity. Tribute from Iraq funded stipends for soldiers, strengthened Medina's treasury, and gave the Caliphate leverage in negotiations with tribes who might otherwise waver. Expansion was survival, not indulgence. To halt would be to risk internal decay. Khalid, however, would not remain forever in Iraq. When the Syrian front demanded reinforcement, Abu Bakr ordered him to transfer. The departure of such a commander left the Iraqi theater weakened, and Persian forces saw opportunities to counterattack. Yet even without him, the seed had been planted. Medina had proven that its armies could march into the richest provinces of Persia and win. The balance of power in the region would never again be what it had been before 633 AD. For the Persian court, the humiliation stung. That desert tribes, once dismissed as minor raiders, could seize cities and rout garrisons shook confidence. Yazdegerd's advisors urged mobilization, and plans were laid to recover what had been lost. Yet factionalism blunted every effort. Nobles hesitated to commit too much, lest rivals exploit the moment. The empire's vastness, once a strength, now became a weakness, as coordination faltered across its breadth. These first raids into Iraq were not yet the end of Persia, but they were the opening chord of its swan song. The Muslims had crossed the frontier and discovered that the mighty empire was not invincible. They had seized cities, forged treaties, and tasted the abundance of Mesopotamia. Each skirmish, each negotiation, each captured market town deepened the foothold. By the time Khalid rode west to Syria, the road to greater battles in Iraq had already been laid. From the deserts of Arabia, riders had stepped into the heartlands of civilization. and found their confidence vindicated. Ahead lay trials harsher than any yet faced, setbacks, defeats, and struggles that would test whether the fledgling state could endure against Empire's full weight. But in these first raids, the believers proved that their reach extended beyond the sands, and that the dream of expansion was no longer fantasy. The Euphrates itself had become a road, and on its banks the clash between a weary empire and a rising faith had truly begun. When Abu Bakr died in 634 AD, grief returned to Medina. But unlike 2 years earlier, the community did not stagger. Authority had become a habit. The mantle of leadership passed to Umar ibn al-Khattab, the stern and uncompromising companion whose very presence seemed carved from stone. Where Abu Bakr had been steady and conciliatory, Umar was direct, a man who saw compromise as weakness. His appointment marked a shift from cautious survival to determined expansion. The frontier armies, already camped along the Euphrates and in the valleys of Syria, now felt the weight of a leader resolved to carry the banner further than ever. Yet Umar inherited not only victories, but vulnerabilities. In Iraq, Khalid ibn al-Walid's dazzling raids had opened wide doors, but his reassignment to Syria left the eastern front exposed. Persian garrisons, bruised but not broken, regrouped under experienced commanders. Yazdegerd III, though young, had nobles eager to prove their loyalty, and each saw in recovery a chance to claim imperial favor. Into this unsettled landscape rode new Muslim commanders, less gifted than Khalid, and the test would prove harsh. The warning came at the Battle of the Bridge. Abu Ubaid al-Thaqafi, eager to demonstrate zeal, led his men across the Euphrates against Persian forces. The crossing was ill-timed, and the Persians deployed war elephants, towering beasts that trampled men and scattered horses unused to their bulk. Panic spread through the ranks as the river hemmed them in. Abu Ubaid himself fell, and retreat turned to disaster. Thousands perished in the waters, and the survivors limped back with stories of terror. For the first time since the Ridda Wars, Medina heard of a catastrophic defeat. The loss chilled morale. Some wondered if the expansion into Persia had overreached, if the desert fighters were fated to shatter against imperial strength. Umar, however, refused despair. He ordered regrouping under Muthanna ibn Haritha, a seasoned leader who knew the terrain and could hold the line with patience. Muthanna's campaigns did not blaze with Khalid's brilliance, but they bought time. Skirmishes along canals and palm groves slowed Persian advances, preventing them from regaining the initiative fully. Medina's forces remained in the field, battered yet unyielding. Diplomacy became as crucial as arms. Persian envoys arrived with offers, sometimes haughty, sometimes pleading. Umar, far from the front, issued instructions that framed these exchanges. Invite surrender through conversion or tribute, but do not bow to intimidation. Letters carried across deserts and rivers bore ultimatums written in stark terms, warning that resistance would mean war till Islam prevailed. These missives, delivered by lean riders to richly robed courtiers, embodied the clash of worlds, one empire clinging to past grandeur, another rising with unshakable conviction. While Persia steeled itself, Medina prepared. Reinforcements were summoned from across Arabia, each tribe contributing fighters bound not only by faith, but by the promise of spoils. Umar personally oversaw the organization, counting supplies, setting stipends, and ensuring no column marched without order. Unlike the Persians, who suffered from noble rivalries, the Caliphate tightened discipline. Commanders quarreled less over precedence, for Umar's authority brooked no challenge. Minor battles paved the road toward the great confrontation. At Buwaib, Muthanna led Muslim forces in a hard-fought engagement that avenged the humiliation at the bridge. Persian cavalry thundered forward, but the Arabs, battle-hardened by their desert wars, held their lines and counterattacked with precision. The Persians fell back, and the victory restored some measure of confidence. Yet even as celebrations spread, everyone knew the conflict was far from over. The empire had not yet committed its full strength, and Yazdegerd urged his nobles to muster one great army that would settle the matter. The scale of mobilization on both sides grew. In Medina, Umar contemplated leading the campaign himself, but advisors urged him to remain at the capital. A caliph's death in battle might undo everything, they warned. Reluctantly, he agreed, entrusting command to Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, a veteran of the Prophet's campaigns. Sa'd was steady, devout, and respected, though plagued by illness during the campaign. Still, his appointment symbolized the seriousness of the coming fight. Meanwhile, Yazdegerd placed his hopes in Rustam, the experienced commander whose authority extended across the empire's heartlands. Rustam, shrewd and pragmatic, gathered levies from nobles who begrudged one another but recognized the peril. War elephants marched once more, along with heavy cavalry and foot soldiers trained in imperial drill. The Persians aimed not merely to repel invaders, but to crush them utterly, restoring the prestige that recent defeats had corroded. Across the plains of Mesopotamia, rumors swirled of an impending clash that would decide the fate of the land between the rivers. Farmers abandoned fields near the roads, fearful of being trampled by armies. Caravan traders diverted routes, uncertain whose toll they would be forced to pay. Even distant tribes heard of the mobilization and debated whether to side with Persia's ancient might or the rising power from Arabia. Sa'd established his camp near Qadisiyah, a settlement along the Euphrates whose open terrain favored maneuver. Letters flew between commanders before swords were drawn. Sa'd demanded submission in the name of Islam, promising protection for those who accepted and ruin for those who resisted. Rustam replied with scorn, insisting that the Arabs return to their barren sands. Yet his tone betrayed unease. The invaders had already taken cities, once thought secure, and their persistence unsettled even veteran officers. The stage was thus set. Both sides had endured victories and defeats. Both had mustered strength for a decisive encounter, and both understood that the coming clash would echo far beyond the field itself. For the Muslims, it was the chance to prove that their faith could withstand empire's full fury. For the Persians, it was the last opportunity to halt a tide before it rose too high. Along the banks of canals, soldiers sharpened swords and checked armor. War elephants were fed and adorned with trappings, while Arab cavalry polished their lances. Sa'd, confined to his tent by illness, prayed and sent orders by messenger. Rustam reviewed his ranks, his face set in grim determination. Between them stretched the fields of Qadisiyah, soon to resound with the clang of steel and the cries of men. The road that began with Khalid's daring raids, that stumbled at the bridge and steadied at Buwaib, now narrowed to a single battlefield. Qadisiyah was no longer a mere frontier town. It was the threshold between two worlds. Beyond it lay the Persian capital and the possibility of empire's fall. Before it stood armies gathered from across tribes and provinces, each aware that history's weight pressed upon their shoulders. The road had led here, and there was no turning back. Two storms broke across the horizons of empire in that summer of 636 AD. In the west, at Yarmouk, Byzantine forces reeled beneath the charge of Muslim cavalry, their banners trampled into the dust of Syria. In the east, near the settlement of Qadisiyah along the Euphrates. Persian and Arab armies faced one another in a confrontation no less fateful. Here the Sasanian Empire, ancient guardian of Mesopotamia, prepared to crush the desert riders once and for all. Opposite them stood Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas and the armies of Medina, determined to carve a road through the very heart of Persia. For 4 days the plain became a cauldron of struggle, each sunrise heralding renewed fury, each sunset leaving the ground strewn with the fallen. Sa'ad himself was stricken with illness, confined to a raised platform within his camp. Unable to mount his horse, he directed the battle through messengers, dictating orders with a will that refused to bend. From his vantage point, he could see the dust rising from Persian elephants, hear the clang of steel, and watch as couriers raced back with tidings of advance or retreat. It was not the role of a warrior charging in person, but his presence steadied the men who looked to him for resolve. Rustam, the Persian commander, arrived with an army said to number in the tens of thousands, assembled from across the empire's provinces. Heavy cavalry gleamed in mail, infantry carried tall shields and spears, and war elephants towered above the ranks, their tusks capped with steel. The Sasanian host embodied centuries of imperial tradition, the weight of which pressed down on every soldier in Rustam's line. He understood the stakes. Failure here would unfasten Persia's grip on its richest lands. The battle opened with cavalry charges and skirmishes that soon escalated into full engagement. On the first day, Persian elephants surged forward, their bulk scattering the Arab horses unused to such beasts. Panic threatened to unravel the Muslim ranks as animals bolted, trampling their own riders. Yet discipline, hardened by years of struggle, restored order. Archers aimed at the elephants' eyes, while nimble fighters hacked at their legs with axes and swords. The beasts shrieked and turned, sowing chaos among the very lines they were meant to shield. Night fell with neither side victorious, and the field echoed with groans of the wounded. Fires flickered as men bound wounds, recited prayers, or whispered to comrades of home. This grim vigil gave the clash its name, the Night of Clangor. The sound of clashing steel and desperate cries lingered long after fighting ceased, imprinting itself on every survivor's memory. At dawn, the struggle renewed. The second day saw brutal melees, columns colliding in clouds of dust. Persians pressed with stubborn determination, their elephants again at the fore, while Arabs countered with swarming assaults that harried the flanks. Each charge seemed on the verge of breaking the other, yet each time the lines reformed, neither willing to yield. Sa'ad's messengers galloped ceaselessly, carrying commands that adjusted formations, recalled cavalry, or urged new thrusts. From his platform he prayed between dispatches, entrusting the outcome to God while refusing despair. By the third day, exhaustion weighed heavily. Armor was dented, swords nicked, and men fought on legs that trembled with fatigue. Supplies of water and food thinned, and both sides knew the climax approached. It was then that fortune, or providence, intervened. A sandstorm swept across the field, its winds whipping dust into Persian faces. Arab fighters, accustomed to desert tempests, seized the moment. Their cavalry surged under the veil of dust, lances striking home before the blinded Persians could react. Rustam's formations, once orderly, staggered into confusion. Amid the storm's fury, the tide turned. The elephants, terrified by the shifting winds and the assaults on their riders, rampaged through Persian ranks. Commanders shouted to restore discipline, but chaos spread faster than orders. The Arabs pressed forward, sensing weakness at last. Cavalry crashed into the disordered infantry, breaking them apart in savage thrusts. The climax came with Rustam's death. Accounts differ on how it happened. Some say he was struck down in the tumult, others that he drowned in a canal while seeking escape, but all agree that his fall shattered Persian resolve. Without their general, coordination dissolved. What began as retreat soon became rout. Soldiers threw down arms, abandoning the field to the advancing Muslims. The fourth morning dawned on silence broken only by the moans of the dying. Persian banners lay in the dust, trampled by hooves and feet. The battlefield stretched wide with corpses, armor, and shattered weapons. Victory belonged to Sa'id and his men, though it had been purchased dearly. Thousands lay dead on both sides, and the survivors bore wounds that would scar them for life. Yet the sense of triumph was undeniable. For the Muslims, Qadisiyah meant more than conquest. It marked the moment when the desert's warriors defeated one of the world's great empires in a pitched battle, not merely by raid or ambush, but by standing toe to toe. The symbolism of elephants falling, of Rustam slain, of imperial banners captured, electrified the Caliphate. Umar in Medina received the news with humility and awe, ordering thanks to be given, but also restraint in boasting. The victory, he declared, belonged not to men, but to God's will. For the Persians, Qadisiyah was catastrophe. Their great field army lay destroyed, their foremost general dead, and the road to Ctesiphon lay open. Yazdegerd, young and untested, saw the empire's defenses crumble before his eyes. Nobles who had squabbled over precedence now faced the reality that imperial survival itself was in jeopardy. Morale, already shaken by years of exhaustion, collapsed in the wake of defeat. The stories of Qadisiyah spread far beyond the battlefield. Tribes along the frontier weighed their allegiance carefully, and many chose submission rather than risk similar ruin. Cities opened gates, some with treaties, others in fear. The battle's reputation became a weapon as potent as any sword. Still, for those who had fought through the 4 days, memories were etched in pain as well as pride. Veterans spoke of comrades cut down, of nights filled with cries, of the stench of blood and dust mingling until the senses dulled. The glory of victory could not erase the human cost, but it gave their suffering meaning. They had stood against empire and prevailed. The plain of Qadisiyah, once an unremarkable settlement, now belonged to history. Its canals and palm groves had borne witness to a turning point in the fate of nations. The Muslims, tempered by the fire of the Ridda Wars and tested against imperial steel, had emerged stronger than ever. Persia, once majestic and unshaken, now reeled toward decline. As Sa'd's army gathered spoils and tended wounds, the road ahead beckoned. Ctesiphon, the capital of kings, awaited. The white palace's arches gleamed in the distance, and the thought of capturing it stirred the men with anticipation. Qadisiyah was not an end, but a threshold, the gateway through which the desert's riders would march into the heart of an empire. The plain of Qadisiyah had scarcely quieted when Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas prepared his men for the next march. Victory over Rustam's host had left the road to the Persian capital open, and every soldier in the camp knew the weight of what lay ahead. The Sasanians had lost their greatest general and the army that once stood as their shield. Beyond the canals and rivers loomed Ctesiphon, seat of kings for centuries, a city where palaces dwarfed mosques and bazaars outshone desert markets. To enter its gates would mean more than conquest. It would mean that the world had turned. Sa'd faced the challenge of advancing through terrain far different from Arabia's dry valleys. The Tigris and Euphrates sprawled across Mesopotamia in a net of rivers and canals, each of them capable of stalling an army. Persian engineers had used these waterways for centuries to control both agriculture and defense, and retreating garrisons could flood fields or cut dikes to hinder pursuit. Saad countered with patience. His men bridged canals with felled palms, filled ditches with rubble, and pressed forward step by step. Skirmishes erupted along the way, but Persian resistance lacked coordination. The loss at Qadisiyah had broken their confidence. What remained were delaying actions, not decisive stands. As the march drew nearer to the capital, rumors spread through villages and towns. Some inhabitants fled with what goods they could carry, fearing the arrival of Arab horsemen. Others stayed, preferring to risk negotiation rather than exile. Saad ordered discipline, forbidding indiscriminate looting. To him, the advance on Ctesiphon was not only a matter of arms, but of legitimacy. A city taken by wanton destruction would be difficult to hold. A city that surrendered with its population intact could be integrated into the new order. This policy, born of both faith and pragmatism, eased the progress of the army, for towns along the way increasingly sought terms rather than battle. When the vanguard reached the outskirts of Ctesiphon, the sheer scale of the city stunned even seasoned fighters. The White Palace, with its famous arch, Tak Kasra, towered above the horizon. Its vast vault seemed to embody the grandeur of empire, a stone banner declaring the Sasanian claim to eternity. Surrounding it stretched gardens, markets, and the quarters of countless inhabitants, a metropolis whose population dwarfed any Arabian town. For men who had grown up in desert oases, the capital appeared almost unreal, a monument to a civilization that had once seemed untouchable. Inside the walls, panic reigned. Yazdegerd III, barely more than a boy, could not command the loyalty of nobles whose faith in the dynasty faltered with each defeat. Courtiers debated whether to resist or to flee, their voices rising in acrimony rather than unity. In the end, the king abandoned the city, retreating eastward with what treasures he could carry. His flight symbolized the collapse of centralized resistance. Without the monarch at its heart, the empire's capital were little more than walls waiting to be breached. The siege unfolded with steady pressure rather than spectacular assault. Saad's forces encircled the approaches, cutting off supplies and ensuring that no relief could reach the defenders. Archers harassed the walls, while engineers probed for weaknesses. Negotiations flared and faded, with Persian officials stalling for time, hoping their absent king might rally aid. None came. As weeks passed, the will to resist drained away. Hunger and uncertainty sapped morale. Eventually, the gates opened. When the Muslims entered Ctesiphon, discipline again determined the outcome. The city was immense, filled with wealth beyond imagining. Textiles, plate, jewels, and silks gathered from centuries of empire. Soldiers long accustomed to scarcity found themselves walking streets lined with treasures. Umar in Medina had anticipated this moment. His instructions to Saad were explicit. Spoils must be collected, registered, and divided with justice. No soldier, however zealous, was permitted to plunder at will. Instead, the wealth of Persia was carefully inventoried, with a fifth sent to Medina as the share of the state, and the rest divided among the troops. The most symbolic moment came when Saad entered the White Palace itself. The Tak Kasra loomed above, its arch spanning wider than anything in Arabia. Within, mosaics glittered, and marble columns rose like forests of stone. Saad, mindful of Umar's orders, is said to have prayed there, declaring gratitude not for worldly gain, but for divine favor. That prayer, performed in the hall of Persian kings, was a declaration that rule had passed from the crowns of empire to the Caliphate. The moment resonated across generations as the turning point when the desert's faith stepped into the grandeur of civilization and claimed it as its own. For the Persians, the loss of Ctesiphon was more than military defeat. It was humiliation. The city had been a symbol of royal authority since the days when Rome itself still trembled at Parthian cavalry. Its fall stripped the dynasty of legitimacy, leaving Yazdegerd wandering from province to province in search of loyal support. Nobles hesitated to rally to him, fearing that his cause was already doomed. Some sought terms with the new rulers, while others clung to hope of recovery, but unity was gone. The redistribution of spoils from Ctesiphon carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. Soldiers who had joined the campaigns with little more than a camel and a sword suddenly found themselves in possession of wealth unimaginable in Arabia. Horses, armor, gold, and silks became common in the garrison camps. Umar, wary of the corrupting power of sudden riches, insisted that discipline be preserved. He established clear stipends and ranks, ensuring that wealth did not fracture the unity so dearly won. In his stern oversight lay the recognition that conquest was only half the struggle. Governing the fruits of conquest was the other half. With Ctesiphon fallen, the map of the Near East altered irrevocably. The Sasanian Empire, though not yet extinguished, had lost its capital and its central treasury. Yazdegerd's flight eastward left him dependent on regional governors whose loyalty wavered. The Caliphate, by contrast, gained not only treasure but also momentum. Armies that had once wondered whether they could endure now carried the confidence of victors who had walked the halls of kings. The transition from battle to administration began swiftly. Saad established camps outside the city rather than dispersing soldiers among the inhabitants. The foundation of Kufa as a garrison town ensured that the conquerors remained distinct from the population they ruled. This arrangement, repeated later in Basra and elsewhere, preserved military cohesion while allowing the Caliphate to govern through existing local structures. Bureaucrats who had once served Persian kings now submitted to new masters, collecting taxes not for Yazdegerd but for Medina. As news of the conquest spread, reactions rippled across the region. In Arabia, tribes who had doubted the value of allegiance to Medina now recognized that loyalty meant access to wealth and prestige. In distant provinces of Persia, nobles reconsidered their loyalties, weighing whether a wandering king could offer more than the disciplined armies of the Caliphate. In Byzantium, the fall of Ctesiphon was noted with alarm, for it signaled that the Arabs were no mere raiders, but an emerging power capable of dismantling ancient thrones. For the soldiers who marched through the White Palace, however, the experience was personal as much as political. Men who had once lived by herding and raiding now walked streets where spices perfumed the air and mosaics shone beneath their feet. The contrast between their desert homes and the imperial capital etched itself into memory. They had not only survived, they had overturned a world. Even so, triumph did not breed complacency. Saad and his men knew that Persia still breathed. Yazdegerd had not surrendered, and armies could still be raised in the empire's vast eastern provinces. The fall of Ctesiphon was decisive, but not final. It marked the passing of one age and the uncertain dawn of another. The Caliphate held the capital, but the struggle for the empire's heartland was only beginning. The conquest of Ctesiphon might have seemed the end of Persia's story, but empires do not collapse in a single blow. Yazdegerd III, though stripped of his capital, still wore the crown, and across the Iranian plateau, nobles rallied to his cause. Pride as much as necessity drove them. The ancient Sasanian dynasty could not abandon its lands without one final struggle. Rumors of mustering armies reached Medina, and Umar ibn al-Khattab knew that the next confrontation would decide whether Persia remained a fractured but dangerous neighbor or fell forever into the hands of the Caliphate. The Persians gathered at Nahavand, a stronghold nestled among hills and valleys in western Iran. Geography favored defense, and the nobles intended to use it. Yazdegerd himself was absent, retreating further east, but he entrusted his generals with assembling what sources later called the last truly coordinated Persian field army. Veterans from past campaigns stood shoulder to shoulder, with conscripts called up from villages, and war elephants again accompanied the ranks. The sheer size of the host rekindled hope that empire's fortunes might yet be revived. Umar responded with care. He refused to underestimate an opponent who had centuries of experience in war. The Caliph ordered reinforcements from Arabia and Syria to march east, assembling a coalition of contingents under the command of Nu'man ibn Mukrin, a leader respected for his courage and humility. Unlike Khalid, whose brilliance lay in audacious maneuvers, Nu'man embodied steadiness, inspiring men through example rather than flair. His task was clear: confront the Persians at Nahavand and break their last strength. The march toward Nahavand revealed the magnitude of the challenge. The Persian army entrenched itself behind fortifications, daring the Muslims to assault. Days passed in stalemate, with skirmishes and probing attacks yielding little. Nu'man convened his commanders beneath the shadow of hills, weighing options. Some urged caution, fearing that frontal assault would bleed them dry. Others pressed for boldness, convinced that delay would only embolden the enemy. In the end, Nu'man resolved to draw the Persians out rather than smash against their defenses. He ordered a feigned retreat, a maneuver as old as war itself. Columns withdrew in disciplined fashion, banners lowered as if demoralized. Persian scouts reported the apparent weakness, and commanders, eager for revenge, seized the chance. They poured from their fortifications in pursuit, abandoning the advantage of terrain. Once they stretched onto open ground, the trap snapped shut. Nu'man's reserves wheeled, cavalry struck from flanks, and the Persians found themselves pressed into battle on terms chosen by their enemy. The clash that followed was ferocious. Persian infantry advanced with shields locked, their heavy armor gleaming in the sun, while cavalry attempted to encircle the Muslim ranks. Nu'man's men fought with the desperation of those who knew the stakes. Archers darkened the sky with arrows, and horsemen crashed into each other with lances leveled. Amid the din, Nu'man rode at the forefront, exhorting his soldiers with cries of faith. His example steadied hearts, even as casualties mounted. During the struggle, Nu'man was struck down, killed in the thick of combat. For a moment, panic threatened to ripple through the lines. Yet discipline, nurtured through years of campaigns, prevailed. Command passed swiftly to his brother and other officers, who concealed his death until victory was secure. This seamless transition, rare in the chaos of battle, ensured that morale did not falter. The army fought on, surging forward in renewed assault until Persian resistance crumbled. By the day's end, the Persian host lay shattered. Survivors fled in disarray, leaving behind weapons, banners, and the bodies of their fallen. The defeat at Nahavand proved catastrophic, for it destroyed not only an army, but the last hope of coordinated imperial resistance. Yazdegerd's generals could no longer assemble forces of such magnitude. The empire's ability to stand as a unified whole had perished on that field. It was for this reason that Muslim chroniclers later called Nahavand the victory of victories. The implications stretched far beyond the battlefield. With centralized resistance broken, the Caliphate could advance deeper into Iran without facing armies capable of halting them in open combat. Cities and provinces, once bound by loyalty to a king at Ctesiphon, now weighed their options individually. Many chose surrender, striking bargains that preserved local privileges in exchange for tribute. Others resisted piecemeal, but such opposition lacked the coordination to reverse the tide. The Sasanian state had not formally ended. Yazdegerd still lived, but its backbone was gone. For the Muslims, Nahavand confirmed what Qadisiyah and Ctesiphon had suggested, that the greatest empires of the age were not unassailable. Arabia, once dismissed as barren and backward, now supplied armies that overturned dynasties. Soldiers who had once fought to defend Medina against apostates now found themselves masters of Persia's plateaus and valleys. The transition was dizzying, but Umar's strict leadership anchored the momentum. He reminded his men that victory came with responsibility, not license, and that discipline must hold even when treasure tempted. News of the battle reached Medina with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. The death of Numan was mourned deeply, for his humility and steadfastness had endeared him to many, yet his sacrifice was framed within the larger narrative of divine favor. He had fallen at the moment of decisive victory, his blood mingling with the soil of a land now open to Islam's advance. Umar ordered prayers of gratitude and mourning alike, balancing celebration with remembrance. Nahavand's outcome also reshaped perceptions beyond Persia. Byzantium, still reeling from losses in Syria, now faced the realization that its eastern rival had effectively collapsed. The balance of power that had defined the Near East for centuries, Rome and Persia locked in rivalry, was gone. In its place stood a new force, rising from Arabia, that had humbled both empires in less than a decade. The political map of the region was redrawn, and no power could ignore it. For Yazdegerd, the defeat marked the beginning of an endless flight. From province to province, he traveled, appealing to governors and nobles for support. Some offered temporary aid, others turned him away, unwilling to risk destruction by associating with a doomed cause. His crown remained, but his authority had evaporated. Without armies to enforce his will, he became a wandering monarch, more symbol than sovereign. In the years that followed, the Caliphate expanded steadily into the Iranian plateau, occupying cities and forging treaties. Resistance persisted in mountains and borderlands, but no Persian host would again assemble to challenge them in a pitched battle. Nahavand had ended that possibility forever. The campaign was not merely another victory, it was the fulcrum upon which Persia's fate turned. The memory of that day lingered among veterans long after. They spoke of Numan's calm before the charge, of the dust that cloaked the plain, of the moment when Persian ranks broke and the tide turned irreversible. Each recollection wove into a larger tapestry, the sense that they had lived through the collapse of an age and the birth of another. Nahavand was not simply a battle. It was the door through which Arabia stepped into empire. Morning sunlight spilled across the river plains as columns of horsemen moved westward. Dust rose from their hooves, trailing behind like banners of earth. Persia had lost at Nahavand, yet the empire's heart still beat in its southern provinces. Fars, cradle of the Sasanian dynasty, and Khuzestan, land of canals and fertile fields, remained strongholds. For the Rashidun Caliphate, securing these territories meant more than plunder. It meant dismantling the very foundation of Persian power. The region of Khuzestan, watered by the Karun River, formed a gateway to Persia's interior. Cities flourished among date palms, canals carried trade and grain, and fortresses guarded routes toward the plateau. One figure came to symbolize local resistance: Hormuzan, a Sasanian noble and governor of Shushtar. Clever and ambitious, he rallied forces even after the empire's backbone snapped at Nahavand. Where other governors bent or fled, Hormuzan prepared to fight, confident that Khuzastan's stronghold could withstand prolonged sieges. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, commanding the Muslim advance, understood the difficulty. Unlike the open plains of Mesopotamia, Khuzastan's landscape favored defenders. Armies had to navigate swamps, rivers, and fortifications built to resist both nomads and imperial rivals. Campaigning here required patience, for speed and maneuver could not alone secure victory. Abu Musa tightened supply lines, built temporary bridges, and pushed steadily forward. Skirmishes flared along canals, but discipline and persistence ensured progress. The siege of Shushtar became the defining episode of this campaign. Its walls, strengthened by centuries of imperial investment, loomed over surrounding fields. Watercourses complicated approach, forcing attackers to build rafts and ford channels under fire. Hormuzan exhorted his defenders with promises of imperial revival, reminding them that Persia's fate rested upon their endurance. For weeks, the city resisted. Archers rained arrows on besiegers, while counterattacks sallied from hidden gates. The struggle resembled a test of wills as much as of arms. Gradually, however, cracks appeared. Supplies dwindled within the walls, and morale sagged. Abu Musa offered terms of safe conduct, assuring survival if the city surrendered. Eventually, Hormuzan yielded. Taken captive, he was sent to Medina, where Umar questioned him personally. Chronicles recall their exchange. Umar, dressed simply, confronting the noble in finery. When asked about the empire's fate, Hormuzan admitted Persia was finished, though embers of resistance might still flare. His surrender marked the end of Khuzestan as a bastion of defiance. With Khuzestan subdued, attention shifted eastward to Fars. This was not merely another province. It was the heartland of the Sasanians, where dynastic legitimacy drew its strength. Cities such as Istakhr, near Persepolis' ruins, bore the weight of ancestral pride. To capture Fars meant striking at the soul of the empire. Local lords, proud of their heritage, resisted fiercely. They fortified hill towns and raised levies, determined to defend ancestral soil. Campaigning in Fars demanded a different rhythm. The plateau's rugged terrain denied swift marches. Mountain passes forced columns into narrow files, where ambushes threatened at every turn. Yet the Rashidun armies adapted. Light cavalry scouted relentlessly, while infantry secured each captured town before moving onward. Progress came slower than in Mesopotamia, but each victory tightened the Caliphate's grip. Here, diplomacy intertwined with warfare. Some Persian nobles, weary of endless conflict, sought negotiated settlements. They agreed to pay tribute in exchange for security, retaining local authority under new overlords. This strategy of accommodation allowed the Caliphate to extend influence without exhausting itself in perpetual siege. Treaties preserved Zoroastrian fire temples and offered guarantees for communities, demonstrating that submission did not always mean erasure. Such pragmatism eased transitions, integrating Persia gradually rather than through wholesale destruction. Still, battles could not be avoided. Strongholds like Istakhr resisted stubbornly, their defenders invoking the memory of past kings. Assaults turned into brutal contests in narrow streets and atop stone walls. Muslim commanders rotated troops to prevent exhaustion, while engineers undermined defenses. One by one, resistance collapsed. Each victory, though costly, weakened the network of Persian nobility until no province could muster large-scale defiance. The conquest of Fars also carried symbolic weight. Persia's dynasty had risen from this soil centuries earlier, its kings drawing legitimacy from ancestral shrines and palaces. When Rashidun banners flew over its cities, the message was unmistakable. The old world had ended. Yazdegerd might still wander eastern provinces, but his claim had lost the ground that gave it meaning. Economically, these regions enriched the Caliphate beyond measure. Khuzestan's fertile fields supplied grain, while Fars contributed skilled artisans and established trade routes. The incorporation of these provinces shifted the balance of wealth dramatically. Arabia, long a land of scarcity, now commanded resources rivaling those of Byzantium. Stipends for soldiers grew, treasuries filled, and the Caliphate could sustain further campaigns without fear of collapse. Social consequences followed closely. Persian administrators and scribes, skilled in bureaucracy, found places within the new order. Rather than sweeping away all structures, Umar and his governors often co-opted them, ensuring continuity in taxation and record-keeping. The coexistence of Arab garrisons with Persian bureaucrats laid the foundation for long-term integration. Over time, the very language of administration began to shift. But in these early years, continuity was essential to stability. The presence of Zoroastrian communities also shaped the evolving policy of the Caliphate. Fire temples continued their rituals under agreements that required tribute but allowed worship. This tolerance, practical rather than idealistic, reduced the incentive for rebellion. Conversion did not come quickly. Indeed, centuries would pass before Islam became dominant in the Iranian plateau. For now, the arrangement was one of coexistence, sealed by the weight of military supremacy. As news spread that both Khuzestan and Fars had submitted, the Caliphate's prestige soared. The Persian heartland, once source of imperial pride, now lay under Rashidun control. Soldiers who had begun their careers fighting rebellious tribes in Arabia now stood as masters of lands filled with cities, workshops, and treasuries. For them, the transformation was astonishing. From the margins of the world to its center in a single generation. In Medina, Umar received reports with caution. He did not indulge in triumphalism. Instead, he reminded his commanders that victory was both test and burden. Wealth could fracture unity as surely as defeat. Stipends were carefully distributed, spoils accounted for, and garrisons established to maintain discipline. His stern oversight ensured that success did not breed complacency. By the close of these campaigns, Persia was no longer a centralized empire, but a patchwork of provinces under Arab authority. Yazdegerd's flight eastward carried him farther from relevance, his appeals for aid growing increasingly desperate. The Caliphate, meanwhile, consolidated gains, building the framework of governance that would anchor expansion for generations. From the marshes of Khuzestan to the highlands of Fars, banners of Medina now flew where once fire altars and palaces had proclaimed imperial glory. The road from Qadisiyah to Ctesiphon had been long, but here in the Persian heartland, the journey reached its most decisive moment. With these provinces secured, the Rashidun Caliphate stood not merely as a conqueror, but as the heir to lands that had once ruled the Near East. The desert had yielded its warriors, and they had reshaped the map of the world. The echoes of conquest rolled eastward, chasing Yazdegerd III across his shrinking realm. Each province lost made the young monarch less a king and more a fugitive. his crown a burden carried from camp to camp. From Ctesiphon, he had fled to Media, from Media to Isfahan, and now into the vast lands beyond the Iranian plateau. Khorasan, with its broad steppes, mountain fortresses, and ancient cities, became his last hope. If any region could still raise armies for the Sasanian throne, it was here, on the edge of the known world, where Persia brushed against Central Asia. Khorasan was no empty frontier. Its cities, Nishapur, Merv, Herat, and Balkh, had prospered for centuries as way stations on the Silk Road. Caravans passed through with silks, furs, gems, and spices, bringing wealth that nourished both merchants and nobles. The region's strategic depth made it attractive as a refuge. The mountains shielded valleys, and the distance from Arabia promised time to rebuild. Yazdegerd hoped to rally local lords and muster one more army that could drive the invaders back westward. The Caliphate, however, had no intention of allowing such recovery. With Fars and Khuzestan subdued, commanders turned their gaze east. Campaigns in Khorasan were not about symbolic victory alone. They were about ensuring that no Persian counterstroke could ever threaten Mesopotamia again. To leave Yazdegerd unchallenged would be to invite perpetual war. To pursue him meant stamping out the last embers of Sasanian resistance. Abdullah ibn Amir and other seasoned commanders led columns into the region. The march east was arduous, crossing deserts, rivers, and mountain passes. Supply lines stretched dangerously long, and coordination among far-flung detachments required discipline. Yet the soldiers had grown accustomed to hardship. Victories in Mesopotamia had given them confidence, and stipends from Persian spoils ensured loyalty. They pressed forward, step by step, into lands that seemed as boundless as the sky above. At the Oxus River, known today as the Amu Darya, one of the defining encounters took place. Persian forces, bolstered by local allies, attempted to halt the Arab advance at this natural barrier. The broad river, swift and cold, seemed a formidable defense, yet Muslim commanders organized daring crossings, using rafts, inflated skins, and sheer determination. Skirmishes raged on the banks as arrows hissed over the water. Eventually, the Arabs secured a bridgehead, forcing the defenders back. The Battle of the Oxus broke the illusion that geography alone could shield Persia's eastern frontier. Merv soon capitulated, a city whose position on the Silk Road made it vital for trade. Its surrender carried immense significance. By opening its gates, Merv acknowledged that resistance was futile, and its example rippled through surrounding regions. Governors and noble families weighed their options carefully. Yazdegerd's appeals for loyalty sounded increasingly hollow compared to the tangible strength of the Rashidun armies. Many chose survival over loyalty to a wandering monarch. The young king's plight grew more desperate with each passing season. He sought support from local magnates, offering promises of restored dignity and imperial favor. Some granted temporary aid, but most hesitated, wary of drawing the wrath of a power that had already toppled Ctesiphon and occupied Fars. Yazdegerd found himself moving constantly, a court in flight, each city less welcoming than the last. His crown glittered, but it commanded no armies. Amid this decline, alliances shifted. Some Persian nobles defected outright, seeking positions under the new rulers. Others negotiated tributary arrangements, paying taxes to Medina while retaining local authority. The Rashidun policy of pragmatic tolerance made such arrangements attractive. Zoroastrian fire temples remained open, and landowners who acknowledged the Caliphate kept their estates. These guarantees encouraged further defections, unraveling the last threads of Sasanian unity. By 651 AD, Yazdegerd's flight brought him near Merv once more. Here, fate overtook him. Accounts vary. Some say he was betrayed by a local miller seeking favor. Others that disgruntled nobles abandoned him to his enemies. Whatever the precise detail, the result was the same. The last Sasanian monarch, descendant of kings who had ruled Persia for over 4 centuries, was slain in obscurity. His body lay not in a palace, but in a humble mill. The grandeur of empire ending in dust and silence. The symbolism of his death could not be missed. Without a monarch, no legitimate banner remained around which Persia could rally. Resistance continued in scattered bands and local uprisings, but these were fragments, not armies. The dynasty that had once rivaled Rome was extinguished, and the Caliphate stood unchallenged from the Zagros Mountains to the Oxus. For the Muslims, the conquest of Khorasan marked both culmination and transition. No longer were they merely avengers of wrongs or seekers of tribute. They had become rulers of a vast land, responsible for governing diverse peoples across deserts, rivers, and mountain valleys. Garrison towns were founded in the east, echoing the model of Kufa and Basra, ensuring that Arab armies remained cohesive while local populations continued their lives under new taxation. Administration blended old Persian bureaucrats with Arab oversight, weaving together 2 traditions into a new imperial fabric. Economically, the gains were immense. Control of Khorasan meant control of Silk Road arteries. Trade now flowed under Muslim protection, enriching garrisons and Medina alike. Silver from Central Asia, silk from China, and spices from India crossed territories no longer contested by Persian kings. Soldiers who had once fought for survival now patrolled routes that connected worlds. Culturally, too, horizons expanded. Persian poetry, craftsmanship, and administrative skill impressed the newcomers. Rather than erase, the Caliphate absorbed, laying foundations for the fusion that would later define Islamic civilization. Arabic would eventually replace Pahlavi in administration, but Persian influence endured in art, literature, and statecraft. What began as conquest transformed into exchange. The fall of the Sasanian dynasty also altered the balance of Near East irreversibly. Byzantium, still struggling after Yarmouk, found itself alone as the last of the old empires. The Caliphate now stretched from the Nile to the Oxus, commanding wealth and manpower that could challenge Constantinople itself. The ancient rivalry that had defined centuries, Rome against Persia, was gone. A new power stood in their place, born of Arabia, yet heir to lands far older. For veterans of the campaigns, the journey east left memories of hardship and awe alike. They spoke of snowy passes unlike anything in Arabia, of endless steppes where horsemen rode as if on oceans of grass, of cities adorned with domes and bazaars overflowing with goods. They had set out as men of the desert and returned as citizens of an empire. And yet, even at its most triumphant, the conquest of Khorasan reminded the Caliphate of its fragility. Armies stretched thin across vast distances, supply lines vulnerable, and local revolts a constant risk. The empire had grown faster than anyone in Medina could have imagined. The challenge now was not to win new battles, but to hold together what had already been gained. The mill at Merv, where Yazdegerd fell, became more than a footnote. It symbolized the passing of an age, the last ember of Sasanian sovereignty extinguished, the crown of Persia toppled not by grand armies, but by the quiet inevitability of abandonment. From that moment, the Caliphate no longer faced a rival on the Iranian plateau. The desert's warriors had crossed rivers, toppled capitals, and chased a king to his lonely death. Their task had ended not with ceremony, but with silence. When the banners of Medina flew over Ctesiphon and Yazdegerd fled eastward, Persia's collapse seemed almost complete. Yet conquest in one direction never meant peace in another. To the west, the Byzantines still held Egypt, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean coast. Though humbled at Yarmouk, their empire remained formidable, its wealth fed by the grain of the Nile, and its fleets still masters of the sea. The Caliphate, stretching now from the Oxus to the Levant, understood that the struggle with Byzantium had only begun. The first act in this rivalry had already unfolded at Yarmouk in 636 AD. There, Khalid ibn al-Walid and his fellow commanders broke the backbone of Byzantine power in Syria. The rout was devastating. Imperial soldiers, trapped between ravines and cavalry charges, perished in thousands. Byzantine authority in the Levant collapsed almost overnight. Damascus, Homs, and Jerusalem eventually submitted, the last after solemn negotiations that allowed the patriarch Sophronius to surrender the city personally to Umar ibn al-Khattab. The holy city's fall carried symbolic weight far beyond its strategic value, for it demonstrated that even the greatest centers of Christian piety could pass under Muslim rule. With Syria and Palestine secured, the frontier shifted southward. Egypt emerged as the next prize, coveted by both sides. For the Byzantines, Egypt was indispensable. Its fertile delta produced the grain that fed Constantinople and sustained the empire's armies. For the Muslims, it offered the wealth of harvests, a base for further expansion along North Africa's coast, and a chance to cut Byzantium's lifeline. Whoever held Egypt controlled more than land. They controlled survival. Religious tensions within Egypt deepened its vulnerability. For centuries, the Byzantine emperors had enforced Chalcedonian orthodoxy, condemning the monophysite doctrine held by most Egyptian Christians, the Copts. This policy meant persecution of local bishops, confiscation of churches, and constant suspicion of disloyalty. To Constantinople, theological uniformity seemed essential. To Egyptian villagers, it meant foreign oppression. When Muslim envoys whispered of tolerance, promising that tribute was all that would be required, many Copts saw in them not enemies, but possible liberators. Umar did not at first rush into Egypt. His nature leaned toward caution, and he knew the risks of overextension. The armies had only just subdued Persia, and governing vast new territories already strained resources. Yet commanders on the ground saw opportunity. Among them was Amr ibn al-As, a veteran of the Syrian campaigns, shrewd in diplomacy and daring in war. He urged the Caliph to approve a thrust into Egypt, arguing that Byzantium's weakness after Yarmouk left the province ripe for the taking. At first, Umar hesitated. To launch an invasion meant committing scarce men to a distant land, separated from Arabia by deserts and hostile garrisons. But reports from scouts confirmed that Byzantine forces in Egypt were few, scattered, and demoralized. Combined with the simmering resentment of the Copts, the argument for intervention became compelling. At last, Umar consented, though reluctantly, sending Amr with a modest force. The decision was characteristic of the Caliph. Cautious, deliberate, but once made, pursued with resolve. While preparations for Egypt took shape, relations with Byzantium elsewhere continued in a tense dance of raids and counter-raids. Along the northern frontier, Anatolia became a zone of constant skirmish. Muslim armies probed mountain passes, tested fortresses, and returned with spoils. Byzantine counterstrokes harassed garrisons in Syria, reminding the new rulers that imperial power, though bruised, was not broken. Constantinople itself remained a looming challenge. its walls rising impenetrable, its fleets able to strike swiftly along the coast. In the wider Mediterranean, Byzantium's navy preserved dominance. Muslim armies might ride swiftly across deserts, but at sea their power was limited. Fleets from Constantinople secured islands, disrupted trade, and carried supplies wherever imperial garrisons still held out. This naval superiority meant that the struggle with Byzantium would not be settled quickly. Unlike Persia, whose armies had been smashed in the field, Byzantium retained both resources and defensive depth. The contrast between East and West was striking. In Persia, Muslim victories led rapidly to collapse. In Byzantine lands, conquest advanced step by step, with each province demanding prolonged struggle. Syria had required Yarmouk, Jerusalem, and subsequent sieges. Egypt would demand still more, as the fortress of Babylon near modern Cairo would demonstrate. The Byzantines could be beaten, but only with persistence. For the Caliphate, the coming war with Byzantium carried deeper implications than territory alone. Persia's fall had delivered wealth, but Byzantium embodied prestige. To defeat Rome's heirs was to claim parity with centuries of imperial tradition, to present Islam not merely as a regional faith, but as a civilization capable of supplanting the legacy of Caesar and Constantine. The psychological stakes matched the material ones. Meanwhile, everyday life in the conquered territories reflected the new balance. In Syria and Palestine, administrators collected taxes under the caliph's authority. Greek-speaking clerks continued their work, now reporting to Arab governors. Garrison towns like Homs and Damascus became centers of military presence, ensuring that local populations did not rise in rebellion. The system of separation, Arab soldiers in their own quarters, natives in theirs, reduced friction, though it also emphasized the new hierarchy. Byzantine rule had ended, but Byzantine culture lingered, woven into the fabric of administration and trade. Egypt's situation offered striking parallels. For generations, Alexandrian bishops had quarreled with Constantinople, and now, as Muslim envoys spread word of their approach, many Copts hoped for relief. The promise of autonomy under tribute sounded preferable to continued persecution. When Amr ibn al-As eventually crossed into Egypt, he would find allies as well as enemies. That balance of hostility and welcome shaped the entire course of the campaign. In Constantinople, Emperor Heraclius, aged, weary, and disillusioned, watched events unfold with bitterness. He had spent his life struggling against Persia, winning great victories only to see them undone by the sudden rise of the Muslims. Now, Syria and Palestine were lost, and Egypt teetered. His health declined, and he reportedly cursed the day he had been born to such burdens. The empire he had once restored through courage now slipped from his grasp, undone not by Persia, his old foe, but by a new power from Arabia. As the decade advanced, it became clear that the Byzantine-Muslim wars were not passing raids, but a new era. Two civilizations, heirs of Rome and heirs of the Desert Prophet, faced one another across a frontier stretching from the Mediterranean to Armenia. Neither would yield easily. Persia's fall had been swift. Byzantium's contest would be protracted, fought in sieges, raids, and shifting alliances. And so, the stage was set. The deserts of Arabia had poured forth armies that toppled one empire and threatened another. Syria lay firmly in Muslim hands, and Jerusalem now answered to Medina. Ahead lay Egypt, rich in harvests, vital to Byzantium, and waiting for Amr ibn al-As to test its defenses. The rivalry that had defined centuries, Rome against Persia, was gone. In its place stood a new struggle, one that would shape the destiny of both empire and caliphate. In December of 639 AD, under a pale winter sun, a small column of riders left the edges of Palestine and turned west. At its head rode Amr ibn al-As, veteran of Yarmouk, shrewd negotiator, and one of the earliest converts to Islam. He had pressed Caliph Umar again and again to authorize the expedition, arguing that Egypt, rich, fertile, and resentful of Byzantine rule, could be taken with boldness. At last, the Caliph had agreed, though with hesitation. Umar did not want reckless adventures, yet he knew that weakness in Byzantium had created an opening too valuable to ignore. Amr's force numbered no more than 4,000 to 5,000. It was an audacious gamble, a tiny host venturing into a province that had fed Roman and Byzantine armies for centuries. But the gamble was carefully calculated. Reports from scouts told of Byzantine garrisons weakened after Yarmouk, of local populations resentful of Constantinople's religious policies, and of fortresses undermanned. The odds seemed daunting, yet Amr trusted speed, surprise, and diplomacy to balance numbers. The first objective was Pelusium, gateway of the eastern delta. The fortress guarded the approach from Sinai, its walls long considered the shield of Egypt. Amr's men surrounded it, probing its defenses with repeated assaults. Resistance was fierce, but the garrison was isolated. After a short siege, Pelusium surrendered, opening the road inland. News of its fall carried quickly through villages along the Nile, shaking confidence in Byzantine protection. From Pelusium, the army advanced to Belbais, another fortified town along the route to the Nile Valley. Here the defenders resisted longer, and tradition speaks of Byzantine envoys attempting negotiation. Amr pressed the siege until the walls fell, securing another step toward the heart of Egypt. The pattern was becoming clear, now small victories accumulating into momentum, each fortress captured reducing Byzantine morale further. By spring of 640 AD, Amr marched toward Heliopolis, city of temples and learning, a place whose past reached back into pharaonic times. Nearby, Byzantine forces gathered under Theodore, the imperial commander charged with halting the invaders. The battle that followed was the first true test of arms on Egyptian soil. Theodore deployed his men with discipline, but Amr's cavalry, honed by years of desert campaigning, proved decisive. Swift flanking charges broke cohesion, and Byzantine formations collapsed into retreat. The victory at Heliopolis opened the Nile Valley. For the first time, the Muslims had defeated Byzantium in a major engagement on Egyptian ground. The triumph, however, did not mean instant conquest. The Byzantines still held strong fortresses, and Egypt's vast distances complicated supply. Amr's army remained small, and every loss counted heavily. He sent urgent messages to Medina requesting reinforcements. Umar, cautious but pragmatic, agreed. Additional contingents marched across the desert, bringing the total force to perhaps 15,000. Still small compared to the resources of Byzantium, it was nonetheless enough to sustain the campaign. As the Muslims advanced, they encountered the complexities of Egypt's religious landscape. The Coptic population, long oppressed by Chalcedonian authorities, regarded Constantinople with suspicion. Patriarchs deposed, churches confiscated, and believers fined for heresy had left deep scars. When Amr's envoys promised tolerance in exchange for tribute, many Copts preferred accommodation over continued persecution. Not all welcomed the newcomers, but the divisions within Egyptian Christianity weakened Byzantine unity at the critical moment. The countryside revealed another truth. Egypt was unlike Arabia or even Syria. Its wealth lay in the Nile, in the endless green fields nourished by the annual flood. Villages stretched along canals, their granaries full, their markets bustling. To desert-born soldiers, the abundance seemed astonishing. This richness explained why Byzantium clung so fiercely to Egypt, for it fed not only Constantinople, but the entire Mediterranean world. Yet the same abundance also made Egypt vulnerable. Whoever controlled the valley controlled a lifeline of grain, and once the Muslims gained foothold, they could sustain themselves from local resources. Their path led on to Babylon Fortress, close to where modern Cairo now stands. This massive stronghold guarded the approach to Upper Egypt and the Delta alike. It was here that Amr would face his most grueling siege, a test that would determine whether the conquest of Egypt was possible at all. Before committing to the fortress, however, he consolidated his victories, ensuring that no garrison behind him could threaten his supply lines. Each success deepened confidence among his men and eroded Byzantine authority further. Throughout these months, Amr's leadership revealed itself in both strategy and diplomacy. He did not rely solely on force. He negotiated truces, encouraged defectors, and cultivated Coptic goodwill. His letters to Umar reflected a balance of ambition and realism. He urged speed, warning that delay would allow Constantinople to send reinforcements by sea. The Caliph, stern as ever, demanded accountability, but recognized the logic of Amr's arguments. Reinforcements continued to arrive in measured numbers, strengthening the expedition without overburdening Medina's resources. Meanwhile, Theodore and the Byzantine commanders grew increasingly desperate. Yarmouk had already drained imperial manpower, and Heraclius's health failed. Egypt could not be reinforced in strength, especially with Syria lost and Anatolia under constant raid. The empire relied on its fortresses, hoping that time and distance would wear down the invaders. But each passing month revealed the futility of that hope. Small as it was, Amr's army refused to collapse. Discipline, faith, and the lure of Egypt's wealth sustained them. By the end of 640 AD, the momentum was unmistakable. A tiny force from Arabia had crossed into one of the richest provinces of Byzantium, defeated its armies in open battle, and compelled its cities to surrender. The conquest was not complete. Babylon and Alexandria still stood, but the balance had shifted irreversibly. Egypt's fate now hung not on whether it would fall, but on how long it would take. For the soldiers who marched with Amr, the campaign was a revelation. They had left Medina with little more than swords, spears, and faith, yet they now camped along the Nile, surrounded by abundance. To men hardened by scarcity, the land seemed like a promise fulfilled. Each victory confirmed that the Empire of Rome was not invincible, and that their own community, once confined to desert oases, could master the granaries of the world. As winter deepened, Amr prepared for the siege that would define the campaign. Babylon Fortress rose before him, its towers casting shadows across the river, its walls thick and formidable. Inside, Byzantine defenders steeled themselves for a fight they could not avoid. For both sides, the coming struggle represented more than territory. To the Byzantines, it was the last stand for Egypt, lifeline of their empire. To the Muslims, it was the key to a new chapter, one that would carry their banners not only across the Nile, but across the sea. Along the Nile's eastern bank, where the river bent around fields and canals, rose a massive bastion of stone. Babylon Fortress, heir to centuries of Roman engineering, dominated the approach to Upper Egypt. Its towers loomed above the landscape, walls thick enough to resist rams, gates reinforced with iron. For the Byzantines, it was the keystone of their defense. As long as Babylon stood, Egypt remained contested. For Amr ibn al-As and his men, it was an obstacle that had to be overcome, if the conquest of Egypt was to be secured. The siege began in April of 640 AD. Amr's army, still modest in size even after reinforcements, encircled the fortress and cut its access to surrounding villages. Yet capturing such a stronghold was no easy matter. Unlike the smaller garrisons at Pelusium or Belbais, Babylon was a true citadel, designed to withstand prolonged assault. Byzantine soldiers within the walls, commanded by Theodorus and supported by the patriarch Cyrus of Alexandria, known among Arabs as al-Muqawqis, prepared for a long defense. Amr tested the defenses with probes and skirmishes. His cavalry harassed foraging parties, while archers attempted to suppress the battlements. But direct assault proved costly. Ladders were repelled, stones rained down, and sorties from the gates drove back attackers. The siege settled into a grim rhythm. Daily clashes, followed by nights of watchfires, chants of prayer, and the moans of the wounded. Both sides knew this was no mere contest of weapons, but of endurance. Negotiation soon accompanied violence. Cyrus, though a Byzantine appointee, had long sympathized with Egypt's Copts, who resented Constantinople's religious oppression. He opened channels with Amr, exploring possibilities for peace. Yet Constantinople forbade compromise, insisting that Egypt must be held at all costs. The conflict between imperial orders and local realities bred paralysis. While soldiers bled on the walls, leaders argued over terms in shadowed chambers. As months dragged on, reinforcements from Arabia arrived. Among them came Zubair ibn al-Awwam, a cousin of the Prophet and renowned for his valor. His presence lifted morale, and his daring would soon tip the balance. Amr reorganized the siege, tightening the encirclement. Trenches were dug to block sorties, towers raised to bring archers closer to the battlements. Gradually, the defenders felt the noose tighten. Still, Babylon held. Its garrison fought with determination, aware that the fate of Egypt rested on their endurance. Supplies, however, dwindled. Cut off from the countryside, the fortress faced hunger and disease. Cyrus pressed for negotiation, warning that resistance might doom the city. Theodorus, bound by duty to Constantinople, refused to yield. Tension simmered within the walls, even as Muslim attacks grew fiercer. In early 641 AD, Zubair proposed a bold maneuver. Under cover of night, he led a chosen band of climbers against the walls. Scaling ladders, they seized a tower, cutting down defenders and planting banners atop the battlements. The sight of Muslim colors fluttering above the fortress shocked the garrison. Though they counterattacked, Zubair's men held fast until reinforcements poured in. The breach was contained, but not reversed. From that moment, Babylon's defenders realized that their fortress was no longer impregnable. The siege continued, but negotiations gained urgency. Cyrus, acting against Constantinople's wishes, met with Amr to discuss terms. The patriarch's motives were complex. He hoped to preserve the Coptic population from devastation, to safeguard the church's position, and perhaps to secure a tolerable future under new masters. Amr offered assurances, tribute in exchange for protection, freedom of worship, and safe passage for Byzantine soldiers who surrendered. Compared to the long history of imperial persecution, such terms seemed merciful. At last, after nearly a year of resistance, Babylon Fortress capitulated in April of 641 AD. The defenders marched out under truce, their lives spared. The city behind the fortress opened its gates, and Amr entered, victorious yet cautious. He knew that the conquest was not complete. Alexandria still awaited, but the fall of Babylon marked a decisive turning point. With the fortress gone, Byzantine authority in Egypt crumbled. The aftermath revealed the dual character of the Muslim advance: ruthless in war, pragmatic in victory. Amr established a garrison near the fortress, but forbade indiscriminate plunder. Taxes were assessed, registers drawn up, and administrators appointed. The pattern established at Babylon would repeat elsewhere: conquest followed by negotiated settlement, integration of local elites, and the separation of Arab soldiers in their own camps. For the Coptic population, the change was profound. Centuries of Byzantine domination had often meant theological persecution. Now, under the Caliphate, they faced tribute but gained autonomy in their faith. Churches reopened, bishops returned from exile, and resentment toward Constantinople deepened into relief. This did not mean universal welcome. Foreign rule remained foreign rule, but it meant that the conquerors could position themselves as protectors rather than oppressors. Strategically, the capture of Babylon opened the road to Alexandria, jewel of the Mediterranean and Byzantium's last bastion in Egypt. Without the fortress, the empire could no longer defend the Nile Valley. Amr prepared his men for the march northward, knowing that one final siege awaited. Yet the conquest of Babylon had already ensured that Egypt would not easily return to Byzantine hands. For the soldiers, the memory of the siege remained vivid. They spoke of endless nights along the riverbanks, of arrows whistling from the towers, of hunger and fatigue pressing as harshly as any sword. They recalled the moment Zubair stood atop the battlements, a lone figure against the dawn, signaling that the fortress was no longer invulnerable. That vision, etched into their minds, became a symbol of faith rewarded through courage. Umar in Medina received the news with characteristic sobriety. He offered praise to God, reminded the army that victory was a test of discipline, and warned against arrogance. His words reflected the tension at the heart of expansion. Triumph carried risks as well as rewards. Wealth could divide as surely as defeat could. The caliph's vigilance ensured that the conquest of Egypt did not dissolve into chaos, but instead fed into the growing framework of the empire. By the time Amr raised his banner over Babylon, the transformation was unmistakable. A small force that had crossed the desert months earlier now held Egypt's heart. The fortress that had once symbolized Byzantine power in the land of the Nile had fallen. Ahead lay Alexandria, but the outcome seemed clear. Byzantium, once master of the Mediterranean's granary, now clung to its edges. The siege of Babylon did more than decide Egypt's fate. It reshaped the balance of power in the entire Mediterranean. With its fall, the Caliphate gained the key to the Nile, and Constantinople lost the lifeline that had sustained it for centuries. The consequences would unfold in years to come, but even in the moment, men sensed that history had shifted. A fortress had yielded, and with it, an empire's grip had slipped. When Babylon Fortress surrendered in April of 641 AD, Amr ibn al-As wasted little time. The keystone of Byzantine defense in the Nile Valley was gone, and only one city remained to decide Egypt's fate. Alexandria, perched on the Mediterranean coast, stood as Byzantium's jewel, a metropolis of marble streets, bustling harbors, and libraries whose renown echoed across centuries. For the Caliphate, capturing it meant not only securing Egypt, but also demonstrating that the heirs of Rome could lose their most prized city. The march northward followed the Nile, its waters glinting under the sun, as columns of Arab horsemen advanced along its banks. Villages surrendered as the army passed, some out of fear, others out of calculation. Byzantine resistance, once anchored at Babylon, had become scattered. Yet Alexandria was different. Its walls stretched for miles, thick and high, guarding a population that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Within those walls, Byzantine commanders gathered troops, while the Patriarch Cyrus of Alexandria once again tried to balance loyalty to Constantinople with pragmatism. The siege began in late 641 and stretched into the following year. Unlike the smaller fortresses encountered before, Alexandria required careful planning. Its harbors ensured that Byzantine fleets could still supply the city, and its defenders knew that relief might come by sea. Amr encircled the landward approaches, cutting off roads and harassing any sorties. Yet the walls defied direct assault. Siege engines struggled against their scale, and repeated attacks faltered. The struggle became one of attrition, where morale mattered as much as weapons. Inside Alexandria, divisions deepened. The Chalcedonian elite, loyal to Constantinople, urged resistance. The Coptic majority, weary of persecution, hesitated. Cyrus, who had negotiated secretly with Amr during the siege of Babylon, leaned toward compromise, though imperial orders forbade it. The tension between local interests and imperial demands sapped unity. As supplies dwindled, the city's leaders faced a choice between ruin and negotiation. Amr understood the power of patience. He tightened the blockade, sent envoys to whisper terms, and allowed rumors of Coptic favor to spread. Gradually, the prospect of surrender became less unthinkable. The fall of Babylon had shown that the Arabs kept their word. Tribute was collected, but churches were left standing. Such examples weighed heavily on Alexandrian minds. At last, in November of 642 AD, Alexandria capitulated. Patriarch Cyrus, once again defying Constantinople, negotiated terms. The city would pay tribute, its people would be spared, and the church would retain its privileges. Amr entered Alexandria not as a plunderer, but as a ruler. Soldiers were kept in discipline, markets reopened, and administration continued. For a metropolis accustomed to upheaval, the transition proved less violent than many feared. The capture of Alexandria reverberated across the Mediterranean. Byzantium, already weakened by the loss of Syria, now faced the reality of losing its granary. Constantinople's streets would no longer be fed by Egyptian grain. Imperial revenues shrank and morale plummeted. Heraclius, who had fought for decades against Persia, only to see Persia vanish before the Arabs, now saw Egypt slip from his empire. He died that same year, a bitter man, leaving successors to grapple with the catastrophe. For the Caliphate, Alexandria's fall was triumph beyond measure. A city that had once rivaled Rome, Constantinople, now acknowledged Umar's authority. Its libraries, its ports, and its artisans enriched the new rulers. Garrison settlements near Fustat became centers of administration, ensuring that Arab soldiers remained distinct from the city's vast native population. The Caliphate did not attempt to erase Alexandria, but to govern it, weaving its wealth into the empire's fabric. Still, Byzantium was not resigned. In 645 AD, 3 years after the surrender, imperial fleets landed a counterattack. Under the command of Manuel, Byzantine forces retook Alexandria in a sudden strike. The garrison was overwhelmed, and for a brief moment, the imperial eagle once more flew above the city's walls. Panic spread among Arab ranks, and the Caliphate faced the possibility of losing Egypt. Amr, recalled to command, responded swiftly. Gathering reinforcements, he marched to reclaim the city. The struggle was fierce, as Byzantine soldiers fought desperately to hold their prize, but discipline and persistence once more carried the day. In 646 AD, after months of fighting, the Muslims stormed Alexandria and drove out the Byzantines. This time, there would be no second surrender. The city was secured permanently, and Egypt passed irreversibly into the orbit of the Caliphate. The recapture underscored the precariousness of conquest. Egypt had not fallen in a single stroke, but required repeated effort. Its wealth attracted Byzantine determination, and only through resilience could the Arabs retain it. Amr ensured that defenses were strengthened, garrisons reinforced, and Fustat developed as a new capital distinct from Alexandria. This deliberate choice prevented future reliance on a coastal city vulnerable to imperial fleets. For the people of Egypt, the changes were profound, yet gradual. Tribute replaced imperial taxes, but the rhythms of agriculture along the Nile continued. Coptic Christians found themselves freer in worship than under Byzantium, though burdened with the jizya tax. Greek-speaking elites adjusted to new patrons, serving as scribes and administrators. Alexandria, though no longer imperial, remained a thriving port, now channeling its wealth eastward toward Medina and beyond. In the wider Mediterranean, the loss of Alexandria symbolized Byzantium's retreat from dominance. Once the unrivaled master of the sea, the empire now found itself on the defensive, clinging to Anatolia and the Aegean. North Africa lay exposed, and within decades, Muslim armies would march along its coast. The conquest of Egypt shifted the balance of power irreversibly, positioning the Caliphate as a force no empire could ignore. Among soldiers, memories of the twin sieges lingered. They spoke of long nights camped by the walls, of hunger endured, of the sudden shock when Byzantine sails appeared in the harbor during the counterattack. They remembered the pride of entering Alexandria twice, first in triumph, then in determination. The city became a symbol of resilience, proof that victory might be contested, but could be secured again with persistence. Umar, upon receiving news of the final recapture, praised God and urged vigilance. He warned Amr not to allow arrogance, reminding him that Egypt's wealth was both blessing and danger. Stipends were distributed, garrisons settled, and administrators appointed. The caliph's steady hand ensured that the conquest was consolidated, not squandered. By the mid-7th century, Egypt's transformation was complete. From Pelusium to Alexandria, from Babylon to the Delta's villages, the land of the Nile belonged to the Caliphate. Byzantium, once nourished by its grain, had been cut off. The Caliphate, enriched by its fields, stood as a rising empire whose reach extended from Libya to Persia. Alexandria's fall and recapture marked the moment when the Mediterranean world itself tilted, no longer a Roman lake, but a contested frontier. The conquest of Egypt was not only a military achievement, it was a declaration that the Caliphate had become a Mediterranean power. From desert beginnings, the community of Medina now commanded cities whose names echoed with centuries of history. Alexandria, with its harbors open to the sea, now looked south and east rather than north and west. The tide of empire had shifted, and with it, the future of the region. At Ctesiphon and Alexandria, conquest brought more than stretches of ground. They delivered into the hands of the Caliphate two of the richest lands in the known world, the fertile plains of Persia and the grain fields of Egypt. Conquest had been achieved with swords and sieges, but holding these provinces required something more enduring: administration, taxation, and the weaving of diverse peoples into a single political fabric. For Umar ibn al-Khattab, this was perhaps the greater challenge. Victory in battle could be fleeting. Integration would decide whether empire lasted. In both Persia and Egypt, Umar pursued a policy that balanced firmness with pragmatism. The old imperial systems were not raised overnight. Instead, they were repurposed. Local bureaucrats, versed in the complexities of taxation, irrigation, and record-keeping, were retained under new masters. Greek clerks in Alexandria, Coptic scribes in the Nile villages, and Persian administrators along the Tigris continued their work, but their reports now flowed toward Medina. Continuity ensured stability. To uproot these structures would have risked chaos. To harness them meant smoother transition. Taxation formed the backbone of integration. Two levies became central: the jizya, a poll tax paid by non-Muslims, and the kharaj, a land tax. In Persia, with its sprawling estates and irrigation works, the kharaj ensured that agricultural wealth filled the Caliphate's coffers. In Egypt, where the Nile's rhythm dictated harvests, grain and coin alike moved into the treasury. These taxes did not aim to force conversion immediately. On the contrary, non-Muslim communities were encouraged to remain, for their contributions sustained the state. Conversion might relieve individuals from jizya, but in the first generations it was rare and gradual. The system brought order, but it also reshaped society. In villages across the Nile, peasants who once paid imperial dues now paid to Arab collectors. In Persian towns, Zoroastrian fire temples still glowed, but their priests counted coins for foreign rulers. The practical effect was continuity tinged with change. Life went on, yet loyalties shifted subtly, as tax rolls and military garrisons made clear who now held power. Umar also established new cities as garrison towns, deliberate creations that symbolized the Caliphate's method of control. In Iraq, Kufa and Basra rose from the ground, planned settlements where Arab soldiers lived apart from the local population. In Egypt, Fustat served the same purpose. These towns housed veterans and their families, ensuring that armies remained cohesive and disciplined rather than scattered among conquered peoples. They also became administrative centers, radiating authority into surrounding provinces. The design was ingenious. Soldiers retained their identity while still projecting power outward. For the conquered, this separation carried mixed meanings. On one hand, it reduced friction, for Arab soldiers did not immediately displace native inhabitants from their homes. On the other, it underscored hierarchy, as garrison towns became symbols of foreign dominance. Yet over time, trade and interaction blurred these boundaries. Markets sprouted near the camps, merchants exchanged goods, and cultures mingled. Slowly, an Arab-Persian and Arab-Coptic synthesis began, though full assimilation lay centuries ahead. In matters of faith, policy carried that same practical bent. Zoroastrians in Persia were recognized as dhimmi, protected communities alongside Christians and Jews. Fire temples continued to burn, bishops led congregations, and synagogues echoed with prayers. What changed was the framework. Protection came at the price of jizya. This arrangement, though unequal, offered security compared to the harsher persecutions that imperial rulers had sometimes imposed. The Copts in Egypt, long marginalized under Byzantine orthodoxy, experienced relief. Under Muslim rule, their patriarch regained authority, and churches flourished more freely than under Constantinople's oversight. Yet tolerance was not equality. Muslims held superior legal status, enjoyed exemption from jizya, and controlled the army. Over time, economic pressure encouraged conversion. Some peasants found relief from taxes by embracing Islam. Others converted for access to new networks of patronage. The process was gradual, stretching over generations. In both Persia and Egypt, the majority remained non-Muslim for centuries, even as Arabic slowly replaced Pahlavi and Greek in official records. Language became another tool of integration. At first, administration relied on existing tongues: Greek in Egypt, Pahlavi in Persia, Coptic in village registers. But as Arab governors consolidated control, Arabic advanced. Coins were struck with Arabic inscriptions, decrees issued in the caliph's tongue. The shift was not immediate, but it carried profound cultural consequences. By the end of the 7th century, Arabic had become the dominant language of administration across the empire, binding disparate provinces into a shared system. Economically, integration transformed Medina from a desert capital into the nerve center of a global empire. Tribute caravans poured in: grain from the Nile, silver from Persian mines, textiles from workshops in Isfahan, papyrus from Egyptian mills. The treasury swelled, and Umar instituted registers to ensure that stipends for soldiers were distributed fairly. Wealth flowed, but the caliph's vigilance guarded against corruption. He lived simply, reminding governors that empire was not license for extravagance but stewardship. The transformation of cities testified to this new order. Fustat, founded beside Babylon Fortress, grew rapidly into a bustling hub of administration and trade. Kufa and Basra, once barren camps, became centers of culture and learning, their mosques echoing with recitation and debate. These garrison towns not only controlled territories, they became crucibles where Arab identity mingled with Persian and Egyptian traditions, laying the foundations for an emerging Islamic civilization. Still, integration was not without strain. Heavy taxes sometimes provoked discontent, especially when governors proved harsh. In Egypt, disputes erupted over assessments and complaints reached Medina. Umar responded with severity, replacing officials who abused authority. In Persia, noble families occasionally rebelled, unwilling to accept subordination. These challenges revealed that conquest was not the same as consolidation. The Caliphate had to adapt constantly, balancing firmness with justice to maintain legitimacy. The symbolism of integration also mattered. When Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas prayed in the White Palace of Ctesiphon, it marked a transfer of authority from the crowns of Persia to the Caliphate. When Amr ibn al-As established Fustat beside Babylon, it symbolized a new center rising from the ruins of empire. Such moments were not mere anecdotes. They were deliberate acts that reshaped how conquerors and conquered alike understood the new world. By the time Umar's decade-long rule drew toward its end, Egypt and Persia were no longer foreign conquests, but integral parts of the Caliphate. Their revenues sustained armies campaigning in Armenia and North Africa. Their administrators staffed the machinery of state, and their cultures began to blend with the desert's faith. The Arab community, once confined to oases and caravan towns, now governed lands of ancient civilization, absorbing their legacies even as it imposed its own. The integration of Egypt and Iran was not complete, nor was it uncontested. Resistance flickered in mountain valleys, and discontent simmered in villages. But the broad pattern was unmistakable. The Caliphate had learned to govern not as raiders, but as rulers, shaping policies that allowed conquest to endure. What had begun with swords was sustained by registers, taxes, treaties, and garrison towns. As Umar walked Medina's streets in simple garments, he knew the weight of what had been achieved. Empires older than memory had fallen. Their wealth now flowed into the coffers of a community barely a generation old. Yet he never let his companions forget. Victory was a test, an empire a trust. The future of the Caliphate would depend less on the brilliance of battles than on the wisdom of governance. In the year 651 AD, in a humble mill near Merv, the long shadow of the Sasanian dynasty flickered out. Yazdegerd III, last heir of the House of Sazan, met his end not upon a battlefield surrounded by loyal soldiers, but in obscurity, betrayed by those whose aid he had sought. The boy king, who had once worn the crown of Ctesiphon, died far from palaces. His body left where grain was ground to flour. With him ended 4 centuries of imperial rule, and Persia passed irreversibly into the orbit of the Caliphate. Yet his death was not the close of conflict. Long after Yazdegerd fell, pockets of resistance endured in mountain strongholds, desert oases, and remote valleys. Noble families, clinging to pride, raised bands of fighters. Zoroastrian priests stirred their followers with vows to defend the sacred flame. Some revolts were crushed swiftly, others lingered for years, gnawing at the edges of Rashidun authority. Securing the conquests required persistence as relentless as the wars that had won them. In Persia, governors tightened administration. Garrison towns like Kufa and Basra became anchors of power, from which columns rode to suppress rebellion. Arab settlers farmed land around these new cities, while Persian scribes ensured the machinery of taxation did not falter. Over time, the image of foreign occupation shifted, from raiders sweeping in from the desert to rulers who could enforce order, settle disputes, and maintain roads. The transformation was uneven, but it was inexorable. Egypt required similar consolidation. Although Alexandria had fallen twice, the threat of Byzantine counterattack remained. Imperial fleets still patrolled the Mediterranean, and Constantinople had not abandoned hopes of recovery. Amr ibn al-As fortified positions along the coast, reinforced Fustat, and ensured that tribute reached Medina reliably. With each passing year, the likelihood of Byzantine return diminished, but vigilance remained constant. Egypt's grain filled the Caliphate's coffers, feeding garrisons as far as Iraq. What once sustained Constantinople now nourished Medina. The transition from conquest to governance coincided with the Caliphate's first succession. Umar's assassination in 644 AD shocked the community, yet his discipline left structures strong enough to endure. Uthman ibn Affan, chosen as the third caliph, inherited an empire stretching from Libya's deserts to Central Asia's steppes. Expansion continued under his watch. Campaigns pressed deeper into Armenia. Raids reached across North Africa, and ships tentatively tested the Mediterranean. But even as frontiers advanced, the challenge of securing existing territories grew sharper. Conversion remained slow. In both Persia and Egypt, most inhabitants continued their ancestral faiths for generations. Zoroastrian fire temples burned brightly, Christian churches echoed with hymns, and Jewish communities prayed in synagogues. The Caliphate did not insist upon immediate transformation. Instead, it taxed non-Muslims, safeguarded their lives, and allowed them to worship under conditions of subordination. Economic reality favored gradual Islamization rather than forced conversion. The treasury relied heavily on jizya. A sudden wave of converts would have diminished revenue. Thus, paradoxically, the spread of Islam moved at the pace of generations, shaped by social incentives more than edicts. Still, pressure existed. Muslims enjoyed privileges in law and taxation. To convert meant release from jizya and access to the networks of Arab patronage. Over time, this subtle advantage reshaped society. Persians adopted Arabic names, Egyptians learned to write in Arabic script, and children grew up between worlds. The Caliphate's strength lay not only in arms, but in its ability to mold identities slowly, bending populations toward integration without breaking them. As the empire expanded, tensions also brewed. Soldiers, enriched by conquest, expected stipends and land. Governors, often from the Prophet's generation, exercised authority that sometimes clashed with Medina's oversight. Complaints of favoritism arose, particularly under Uthman, whose appointment of relatives fueled resentment. In Kufa, Basra, and Fustat, murmurs of discontent hinted at divisions. The unity forged under Muhammad, tested in the Ridda Wars and solidified in conquest, now faced the strain of governing an empire far larger than Arabia itself. The first fitna, civil war among Muslims, loomed on the horizon. Though it erupted after Uthman's assassination in 656 AD, its seeds lay in these years of rapid expansion. The very speed of conquest had created tensions over wealth, authority, and legitimacy. While armies triumphed abroad, discord simmered at home. The paradox of empire emerged. Victories brought burdens as heavy as defeats. Yet even amid internal strains, the Rashidun conquests secured their legacy. The borders achieved by the mid-7th century endured as the foundation of later Islamic states. Persia, though still Persian in language and culture, was permanently transformed by the presence of Islam. Egypt, though Coptic Christianity persisted, now oriented south and east rather than north toward Constantinople. The map of the Near East had been redrawn, not temporarily, but forever. For Zoroastrian communities, survival meant adaptation. Fire temples remained active, though diminished. Priests preserved rituals, texts, and traditions under the status of dhimmi. Men fled eastward into India, where they became known as Parsis, carrying their faith into exile. Those who stayed navigated life under Muslim rulers, negotiating autonomy through payment of taxes and acceptance of subordination. They were no longer imperial faith, but minority, a transformation as profound as any battle. Christianity, too, endured. In Egypt, the Coptic Church flourished with newfound autonomy, free from Byzantine imposition. In Syria, Jacobite Christians continued their liturgies. The Caliphate's rule, though demanding tribute, proved less doctrinally intrusive than Constantinople's. For many, life under Muslims meant fewer theological quarrels imposed by force. By the close of Uthman's reign, the Rashidun Caliphate stretched across continents. From Cyrenaica in North Africa to the Oxus in Central Asia, from Armenia's mountains to Arabia's deserts, one political authority commanded. Soldiers who had begun as desert tribesmen now stood guard over cities that had once been the pride of empires. Administrators balanced Arab garrisons with local bureaucrats, crafting a hybrid system that sustained power. The transformation was staggering. Within less than 20 years, the Muslim community had risen from a beleaguered city in Arabia to the master of half the known world. Persia's crown lay broken, Byzantium's granary was lost, and the balance of power that had defined centuries had collapsed. What remained was a new order, built upon the faith of the desert prophet and the discipline of his companions. Even so, beneath triumph lay fragility. The unity that had carried armies across continents now faced its sternest test: how to hold together when the prophet's companions themselves quarreled over authority. The conquests had secured lands, but the question of governing hearts remained. Still, the legacy of the early Muslim conquests was undeniable. They reshaped civilizations, redirected trade, and redefined faith across continents. The fall of Yazdegerd in a mill at Merv, the surrender of Alexandria's harbors, the prayers recited in the White Palace of Ctesiphon, each moment told the same story. The world of Rome and Persia had ended. The world of Islam had begun.